Welcome back to Bark Bites Comics. I'm your host, Jasper Bark, and this is the second in our three-part series about the legendary horror comics character Swamp Thing. If you didn't see the first episode, don't worry, but if you like this one, please go back and check it out. This show, we're going to be looking at Alan Moore's groundbreaking run on Saga of the Swamp Thing. But before we get to that, I would be very grateful if you would go below, find that like button and that subscribe button and smack those little babies like they were the last two flies on the wall of your favourite orgy. Because it really does help not only this show, but the House of Shadows and Ink channel. And now, back to Alan Moore. Who was Alan Moore before Swamp Thing? Alan Moore was a lesser-known British writer who'd begun life in the late 1970s as a cartoonist, doing strips for the British music magazine Sounds and his local newspaper. By the beginning of the 80s, he had graduated to writing backup strips for Doctor Who Weekly and 2000 AD. His work soon became popular enough with readers that he was given the writing chores for Captain Britain at Marvel UK, Halo Jones at 2000 AD, and Marvel Man, later to be Miracle Man, and V for Vendetta at the British black and white comic magazine Warrior. Warrior was published by a hustler called Des Skin, who soon recognised that the high quality of the strips he was publishing were very, very valuable. This meant the way to go, he thought, was to license the work he'd already published to the American market and the European market. So, Des, at the beginning of the 80s, spent a lot of time doing the rounds of the American publishers, showing them the work that he published in Warrior. Eventually, he came to the DC offices, and that's how Alan Moore's work fell into the lap of the editor of Swamp Thing, Len Wein. Len was immediately struck with the high quality of Alan Moore's writing on Miracle Man and V for Vendetta. At the same time, he was a little bit concerned about his friend Marty Pascoe, who was then writing Saga of the Swamp Thing for him. He thought Marty was stretched a little thin with all his writing work, and also sales were not good on the title, and he knew he needed to replace Marty. As soon as he read Alan Moore's work, Len knew he'd found his replacement. So, the very next day, he phoned up Alan Moore first thing in the morning. Now, first thing in the morning in the States is round about tea time, as we call it here in the UK. So Alan Moore answered the phone with a mouthful of cake to hear a guy with an American accent ask him if he'd like to write Swamp Thing. Now, in those days, in the very early 80s, almost no British comics writers worked in American comics. It was pretty unheard of. So Alan thought this was one of his friends phoning him up to wind him up, and he very nearly told Len Wein to F off. Luckily, he didn't, and he soon realised that the offer was in earnest. He, of course, because this was a huge opportunity for him, accepted the gig on the spot. And that's how he came to join Swamp Thing with issue number 20, a move that would go on to revolutionise American comics, horror comics, and in fact comics across the world forever. Was it all down to Alan Moore? Oh, hell no. The artistic team were already in place on the book when Alan Moore began writing it. Steve Bissette, John Totleben and Rick Veitch all met at the Joe Kubert School of Comic Art. In fact, Bissette and Veitch met on the very first day and became best friends for life, helped in no small part by the fact that Bissette was already a fan of the underground comic work that Rick Veitch had done before joining the school. They soon became really good friends with John Totleben and another artist called Tom Yates. The four became a unit, and when they graduated from the Joe Kubert School for Comic Arts, they moved into a house cum studio together that they dubbed the House of the Dutch Masters. Of the four, the first artist to get regular paid professional work was Tom Yates, and his first gig was the Saga of the Swamp Thing, illustrating Marty Pascoe's work. After about 8 issues, the relentless and grinding deadlines were beginning to wear Tom Yates down. He was beginning to fall a little bit behind. So he turned to his 3 friends from the Joe Kubert school to help him out. He just needed somebody to come in and fill in backgrounds for him, help him out with panel composition, and ink or pencil the odd page for him. In return for that, he would pay Steve, John and Rick $50 a day. This was quite a common practice back in those days and still is to this day. This meant that all 3 artists were already very well acquainted with the Swamp Thing universe by the time issue 13 came around, and Tom Yates decided that he'd had enough. He recommended that Steve Bissette and John Totleben try out for the gig as his replacement. So they roughed up some sample pages for editor Len Wein, with Steve Bissette penciling some and John Totleben inking, and John Totleben penciling some and Steve Bissette inking. They soon came to the conclusion that Steve Bissette was a much more natural storyteller and had a much better grasp of layout, whereas John Totleben was much better on the finer details and was more suited to being an inker. Len Wein agreed, and he hired both artists to work together on the book from issue 16. They didn't actually draw as a team Alan Moore's first script. That was issue 20. Where he was simply tying up all the loose ends of Marty Pasco's run. That was drawn by, or rather penciled by, Dan Day and significantly redrawn by John Totleben when he inked it. The book that Bissette and Veitch and Totleben came together to draw was issue 21, The Anatomy Lesson, the comic that perhaps single-handedly changed the entire course of horror comics forever. Is Anatomy Lesson as good as you've heard? It's better. As soon as he got the script for issue 21, Steve Bissette was absolutely blown away. He became convinced that it was the single best comic script he'd ever read in his life, and he immediately showed it to John and Rick, and in fact anybody who would sit still long enough to read it. The Anatomy Lesson tells the story of what happens to Swamp Thing after he's gunned down in the swamp by General Sunderland's forces at the end of issue 20. General Sunderland has Swamp Thing's body cryogenically frozen and flown to his headquarters in New York in a large computer-controlled corporate skyscraper. Sunderland then has Dr. Jason Woodrue, who's better known as the supervillain the Floronic Man, released from prison so he can dissect Swamp Thing's body and learn its secrets, because Woodrue is the world's leading authority on intelligent vegetables. Woodrue begins work dissecting the Swamp Thing's body, but he soon comes to learn that all of the organs in the body, the heart and the lungs, are simple lumps of vegetable matter that don't work as organs. In fact, even his wooden skeleton is completely inoperable. This leads Woodrue to form an absolutely revolutionary theory. This theory is based on an actual experiment where scientists took a group of planarian worms and they taught them to go through a maze. As soon as the planarian worms had successfully learned how to navigate the maze, they were ground up and fed to other planarian worms that hadn't gone through the maze. Because science. Anyway, what the scientists discovered was that the planarian worms that couldn't do the maze could actually complete the maze as soon as they'd eaten their brethren who had been trained to go through the maze without any training whatsoever at all. This led the scientists to come to the conclusion that intelligence and memories can be ingested and absorbed by organic matter. Woodrue tells Sunderland this is what has happened in the case of the Swamp Thing. When Alec Holland fell into the waters of the swamp, he wasn't transformed into Swamp Thing. What actually happened was the vegetable matter that was really dense in the swamp absorbed the intelligence and memories of Alec Holland and then formed itself into a rough approximation of his body. So what he's saying effectively is that Swamp Thing isn't a man who's been turned into a vegetable monster. He is a vegetable which still thinks of itself as a man. Sunderland is blown away by Woodrew's theory, but he always intended to double cross him and send him back to prison so he could profit from Woodrew's findings. Anticipating this, Woodrew sabotages the cryogenic freezer where Swamp Thing's body is kept, knowing that Swamp Thing isn't in fact dead, he's just in shock, and as soon as his body thaws out, it will regrow itself. Swamp Thing climbs out of the cryogenic freezer and then reads Woodrew's report, and the truth of his condition is revealed to him. This has an absolutely catastrophic effect on Swamp Thing's psyche, and in a murderous rage, he kills General Sunderland and returns to the swamp. In one 23-page story, Alan Moore completely reframes the entire concept of the Swamp Thing saga. Swamp Thing is no longer a man in search of his humanity. He has in fact become an Earth elemental. Following this issue, Swamp Thing would go on to face off against the Pharaonic Man and to thwart his plans to take over the world. Next, he would come up against Jack Kirby's character, the demon Etrigan, and he would come face to face with Etrigan in, of all things, a school for severely autistic children. After these two runs, we get to another landmark issue. Issue 29's Love and Death. Is Love and Death an important story? Very. To this day, it remains one of the most visceral and disturbing horror comics ever produced. In fact, it was so disturbing that the Comics Code Authority refused to allow it to be published without significant changes. The creative team, Alan Moore, Steve and John, positively refused to change a single line in the whole story. And this prompted Karen Berger, who'd taken over the editorial reins from Len Wein, to make the decision to put out Saga of the Swamp Thing without the Comics Code Authority seal of approval on it. This one single act helped to launch the adult-oriented, creator-owned comics revolution that soon birthed the Vertigo line. That's right, without this one story, it could be argued that there would have been no Vertigo, which meant there would have been no Hellblazer, no Sandman, no Preacher, no Fables, no Invisibles. That is how important this one single comic is. It features corpses which have been reanimated by demonically possessed insects that are infesting their flesh. These corpses have been reanimated by Swamp Thing's old arch nemesis Anton Arcane, who now resides in hell. He has taken over these corpses so he can capture his niece Abigail, whom he has been molesting since she was a child, and drag her physically down to hell to be his plaything. Swamp Thing, upon learning this, decides, like Odysseus in the underworld, to use his newfound powers as an earth elemental to travel to the afterlife to rescue Abby. Along the way, he's helped by a series of supernatural characters from the DC universe that at that point had gone completely out of print, like the Dead Man, like the Phantom Stranger, and like the Spectre. Following this story, all those characters would go on to have their own titles, helped in no small part probably by the success of this story. Anyway, Swamp Thing is successful in freeing Abby from Arcane's clutches, and the two leave hell and then eventually become lovers. Did they really have vegetable sex? Yes, and it inspired the plot for the movie Swamp Thing 2. The idea began to take shape a little before Alan Moore came on the book as a writer, when Steve, John and Rick went to a party at the artist Tim Truman's house. They had a little bit too much to drink and probably took some other substances and started to think about wild ideas they'd like to see in the Swamp Thing strip. One of the ideas that Rick Veitch came up with was the idea that perhaps Swamp Thing's body could start to grow tubers out of it that humans could actually eat. And John Totleben suggested that these tubers would be hallucinogenic. When Alan Moore came on as a writer, he's a very collaborative individual, and he asked John and Steve if there were any ideas that they'd like to see in the strip. So they sat down and wrote him out a list of all these wild ideas they'd had, including the edible hallucinogenic tubers. Alan Moore thought this idea was positively diseased, and he filed it away for future use. After the Love and Death storyline, when Abby and Swamp Thing became lovers, Steve Bissette wrote to Alan and said, "Isn't it a bit strange that we can't actually show them as physical lovers, that we can't do a love story between an earth elemental and a human being?" And Alan Moore sat down and began to think about how a human being would actually be physically intimate with an earth elemental. That's when he remembered the idea for the hallucinogenic tubers and thought, well, perhaps the human being would have to ingest a part of Swamp Thing, and this part would of course be one of the tubers that grows on his body. And so he sat down and he wrote Rites of Spring, which is an absolutely wild psychedelic erotic romp where Abby becomes physically intimate with Swamp Thing, and it's a mind-expanding, transcendent experience. Nothing like this had ever been seen in horror comics or even comics before, and it totally changed the landscape of what was possible in a mainstream comic. But this wasn't the only wild idea that Alan Moore was exploring at this time. He began to lean into the idea of Swamp Thing being an earth elemental and began to wonder if Swamp Thing even needed to stay in one body. Perhaps he could leave one body and regrow another body in a different part of the swamp. Not only a different part of the swamp, but perhaps a different part of the world. In fact, anywhere on the planet where plants grew, Swamp Thing could probably grow himself a body through travelling through a psychic space which connects all plant life, known as the green. He was totally reframing, changing and revolutionising the entire concept of this character. Didn't John Constantine first appear in this run? Yes. Among the many ideas that John and Steve sent to Alan when they first began working together on the comic was a request to include a character that looked just like Sting. I guess John and Steve really liked drawing Sting. At the same time, Alan wanted to do a series of stories that reinvented the classic horror comic tropes. In order to do this, he hit upon the idea of introducing a character that was part con man and part chaos magician, who would lead Swamp Thing across the United States to face off against a series of supernatural threats, always remaining one step ahead of him. And so, John Constantine, Man of Mystery, was born. The whole series came to a head with a grand finale wherein Swamp Thing worked together with John Constantine to stop the coming of Armageddon. Now you might think with such an explosive finale that Alan Moore would be done with Swamp Thing, but he still had a lot of stories to tell. Unfortunately, Steve and John didn't, and they quit the book. Who could possibly follow John and Steve? Step forward, Rick Veitch. As we've already established, Rick had been working behind the scenes on the book since issue 8, and along the way he'd drawn many fill-in issues. So he was the perfect person to take up the reins as the full-time artist with issue 51. During Rick's tenure, Abby would be arrested for crimes against nature because of her relationship with Swamp Thing. She was taken to Gotham City, where she was held and imprisoned, and this caused Swamp Thing to unleash his entire powers as an Earth elemental upon the city of Gotham, so they would release his lover. And this brings Swamp Thing up against Batman, who discovers that Batman discovers that he cannot beat the Swamp Thing, so he suggests to the authorities that the love between a human and an Earth elemental is perhaps not a crime against nature. Unfortunately though, Swamp Thing has totally scared the US government with this exertion of his powers, and they hire Lex Luthor, an expert in fighting metahumans, to take Swamp Thing out. Luthor develops a device that will cut Swamp Thing's soul off from the green, thereby stopping him from growing any more bodies. And they shoot down Swamp Thing's body, and Swamp Thing's spirit, Swamp Thing's soul, is exiled off the planet. He then begins another odyssey where he explores life on other planets and encounters all of the somewhat forgotten science fiction characters from the DC universe. Finally, in issue 63, he finds his way back to Earth in the issue Loose Ends reprise, and he is reunited with Abby. This only leaves issue 64, Good Gumbo, to wrap up the whole series in what, for once for Alan Moore, is a happy ending. When Alan Moore began this book in 1983, he was a little-known British writer. By the time he finishes 4 years later in 1987, he is probably one of the single most famous comic writers in the world. Thanks in no small part to series like The Watchmen, which he wrote towards the end of his run on Swamp Thing, but the whole success with Watchmen would not have been possible. In fact, much of what has happened since in the world of horror comics would not have been possible without Alan Moore's work and Steve Bissette's work and John Totlebin's work and Rick Veitch's work on this seminal horror comic. Alan Moore bows out with issue 64, but Rick Veitch stays on, not only as the penciler of the book, but also as the writer. But that, as they say, is another story for another show. Thanks for watching.